Chapter 1. Understanding Your Enemy. What the Black Death actually was. Before you can survive something, you need to understand what you're up against. And here's your first advantage over medieval people. You're about to learn what the plague actually is, something they never figured out. The Black Death wasn't one disease. It was primarily bubonic plague, caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, carried by fleas that lived on black rats. But it also manifested as pneumonic plague, which attacked the lungs and spread person to person through the air, and septicemic plague, which infected the bloodstream. Each form had different transmission methods, different symptoms, and different survival rates. Bubonic plague gave you the best odds. If you contracted it, you had maybe a 40 to 60% chance of survival, even without modern medicine. The bacteria would travel through your lymphatic system, causing those infamous buboes, swollen, painful lymph nodes in your groin, armpits, and neck that could grow as large as apples. You'd spike a fever, experience chills, headaches, and extreme weakness. If your body's immune system could fight off the infection before it spread to your blood or lungs, you might actually make it. The buboes themselves were absolutely excruciating. Imagine lymph nodes swelling to the size of chicken eggs or even larger, filled with pus and blood, pressing against nerves and tissue. The pain was so intense that some victims couldn't move the affected limbs. The skin around the buboes would turn dark purple or black, stretched tight over the swelling. Some would burst on their own, releasing foul-smelling discharge. Others would harden and remain as permanent lumps even after recovery. The fever that accompanied bubonic plague wasn't just uncomfortable, it was debilitating. Temperatures could spike to 104 or 105 degrees Fahrenheit. You'd alternate between burning up and shaking with chills so violent your teeth would chatter. Delirium was common at these temperatures. Victims would hallucinate, speak nonsense, or lose consciousness entirely. Some never regained their mental faculties, even if their bodies survived. Pneumonic plague was a different story entirely. Once the bacteria reached your lungs, you were coughing up bloody sputum and struggling to breathe. Without antibiotics, survival rate? Nearly zero. You had maybe 3 to 4 days from first symptoms to death. This was the express lane to the grave. The progression of pneumonic plague was terrifyingly rapid. It would start with a simple cough, maybe some chest tightness. Within hours, you'd be coughing up pink, frothy sputum. By the second day, it would turn red with blood. Your lungs would fill with fluid, making each breath a struggle. You'd feel like you were drowning from the inside. The panic and terror of suffocating while fully conscious was perhaps worse than the physical pain. Victims would gasp and wheeze, their lips turning blue from oxygen, deprivation, eyes wide with fear as they fought for each breath. What made pneumonic plague especially dangerous was its transmission method. Every cough, every laboured breath expelled bacteria-laden droplets into the air. Anyone within a few feet could inhale them. In the crowded conditions of medieval homes and cities, one pneumonic plague victim could infect dozens of people within days. Entire households would be wiped out in a week. Entire city blocks would go silent within 2 weeks. Septicemic plague was even worse. The bacteria in your bloodstream would cause tissue death, turning your fingers, toes, and nose black, which is actually where the Black Death name comes from. If you reached this stage, you were already gone. Medieval people just didn't know it yet. Septicemic plague could develop in 2 ways, either as a progression from bubonic plague, when the bacteria entered the bloodstream, or as a primary infection from a flea bite that went directly into the blood. The primary form was mercifully rare but almost universally fatal. The bacteria would multiply so rapidly in the blood that the body's defences were overwhelmed within hours. The blackening of extremities happened because the bacteria released toxins that caused blood vessels to clot. With blood flow cut off, tissue died and turned necrotic. Fingers and toes would literally turn black and hard, like charred wood. The nose would blacken, sometimes ears, lips, or patches of skin on the arms and legs. Victims in this state would have massive internal bleeding, blood seeping from their gums, nose, and other orifices. The end usually came from shock as the circulatory system collapsed entirely. Here's what gives you a survival edge. In 1347, people had absolutely no idea what caused disease. They blamed bad air, divine punishment, the alignment of planets, and Jewish conspirators. They tried treatments like bloodletting, which actually made things worse by weakening the immune system. They created plague doctor masks filled with herbs, thinking the smell would protect them. It didn't. The theory of miasma, bad air, dominated medieval medical thinking. Doctors believed that foul smells from rotting organic matter, swamps or human waste created corrupted air that caused disease. This led to some counterproductive behaviours. People would seal their windows tight, trapping themselves in poorly ventilated spaces where airborne pneumonic plague could spread more easily. They'd carry pomanders, balls of perfumed herbs, thinking pleasant smells would ward off the bad air. Rich people would flee to the countryside, partly because the air seemed fresher, which accidentally worked but for the wrong reasons. The astrological explanations were equally misguided but widespread. In 1345, a conjunction of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars in the sign of Aquarius had occurred. Many scholars and physicians pointed to this as the cause of the plague. They calculated that this alignment had corrupted the air and would continue to influence disease patterns. People would time their activities, travel, and treatments based on astrological charts, completely missing the actual disease vectors crawling on the rats in their homes. Bloodletting deserves special mention as a particularly harmful treatment. Medieval medicine was based on the theory of 4 humours: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Disease was thought to result from imbalances in these humours. For plague, with its fevers and inflammation, doctors often prescribed bloodletting to reduce excess blood and heat in the body. They'd open veins or apply leeches, draining patients who were already weakened by infection. This reduced the body's ability to fight the disease and likely killed patients who might have otherwise survived. But you know about germ theory. You understand transmission vectors. You know that fleas and rats are the enemy, and you know that person-to-person contact with pneumonic plague victims is a death sentence. This knowledge alone puts you miles ahead of everyone around you. Understanding that the disease spreads through specific mechanisms rather than divine will or bad air means you can take concrete actions. You know that killing rats reduces transmission. You know that flea bites are dangerous. You know that respiratory droplets from coughing patients are deadly. You know that contaminated materials, clothing, bedding, personal items from the sick, can harbour fleas and should be destroyed. You know that bodies of plague victims are infection sources and should be handled minimally or not at all. This knowledge lets you make rational decisions instead of superstitious ones. While your neighbours are holding religious processions that crowd thousands of people together in perfect conditions for disease spread, you're isolating. While they're blaming and attacking Jewish communities, you're focused on the actual disease vectors. While they're trying elaborate herbal remedies and astrological treatments, you're implementing basic hygiene and quarantine. The plague arrived in Europe via merchant ships from the east in 1347, landing in Sicilian ports. From there, it spread like wildfire through trade routes, reaching every corner of Europe within 4 years. It moved faster than information, faster than anyone could prepare. Cities were hit hardest because of population density. Rural areas had better survival rates, but nowhere was truly safe. The specific arrival point was Messina, Sicily, In October 1347, Genoese trading ships arrived from the port of Kaffa in Crimea, where the plague had been raging. The sailors on these ships were already dying. According to contemporary accounts, the ships arrived with most of their crews dead or dying, but that didn't stop the plague from spreading into the city. Within days, Messina was infected. Within weeks, the surrounding countryside was hit. Within months, all of Sicily was engulfed. From Sicily, the plague spread in multiple directions simultaneously. It moved north into mainland Italy, reaching Genoa, Pisa, and Venice by early 1348. It travelled by ship to Marseille and other French Mediterranean ports. It spread overland through Italy toward Rome, Florence, and Milan. Each city it touched became a new epicentre, spreading the disease further inland. The speed of transmission was unprecedented for medieval times. Trade routes that normally carried goods and information now carried death. Merchant caravans brought it overland. Ships carried it along coasts. Refugees fleeing infected cities brought it to previously safe areas. By mid-1348, the plague had reached Paris, London, and most of France. By 1349, it was ravaging England, Germany, and Scandinavia. By 1350, it had reached Scotland and Ireland. By 1353, Russia and the Nordic countries were hit. Understanding the timeline matters for your survival strategy. The initial wave of 1347 to 1353 was the deadliest, killing an estimated 75 to 200 million people across Eurasia. But the plague didn't disappear. It came back in waves for the next 400 years, returning every generation to remind survivors that the nightmare wasn't over. The death toll estimates vary wildly because medieval record-keeping was incomplete and much documentation was lost. Conservative estimates suggest 30 to 40% of Europe's population died. More aggressive estimates put it at 50 to 60% in some regions. Certain cities like Florence, Venice, and Paris may have lost 2/3 of their population. Some small villages and towns were completely abandoned, everyone dead or fled. The 75 to 200 million global death toll includes not just Europe, but the Middle East, North Africa, and parts of Asia. The plague's origins were in Central Asia, possibly in the steppes of Mongolia or the region around Lake Issyk-Kul in modern Kyrgyzstan. It travelled along the Silk Road trade routes, devastating Muslim territories in the Middle, East, Egypt, and North Africa before reaching Christian Europe. China and India were hit hard in the 1340s and 1350s. The plague was truly a global catastrophe. Your advantage is foresight. If you know it's coming, you can prepare. And preparation, as we're about to see, is the difference between life and death. The key is early warning. If you're in Northern Europe in 1347 to 1348, you have months of warning as reports filter in from Italy and France about the pestilence. Use that time. Don't wait to see if it's really as bad as they say. Don't convince yourself that your region will be spared. Don't waste the precious preparation time you have. Every week you have before the plague arrives in your area is a week to stockpile food, prepare an isolation location, gather necessary supplies, and make hard decisions about your survival strategy. Chapter 2. Your first critical decision. Location, location, location. The moment you hear rumours of a great pestilence sweeping through Italy, you face your most important choice. Where do you go? Cities are death traps. London, Paris, Florence, Venice. These urban centres will lose 40 to 60% of their populations. Some neighbourhoods will be completely wiped out. The population density creates perfect conditions for both rat-borne and airborne transmission. Bodies will pile up faster than they can be buried. The social order will collapse. Food distribution will fail. And if the plague doesn't kill you, the starvation, crime, or fires might. Let's talk specifics about why cities are so dangerous. Medieval cities were incredibly crowded. Houses were built right next to each other, often sharing walls. Families lived in single rooms or small apartments with multiple people sleeping in the same bed. Streets were narrow, sometimes barely wide enough for two people to pass. Markets, churches, and public squares brought hundreds or thousands of people into close proximity daily. The sanitation in medieval cities was atrocious. Human waste was often thrown into the streets or into rivers that also served as water sources. Garbage piled up in alleys. Dead animals rotted where they fell. Butchers and tanners dumped offal and toxic waste into streams. The smell alone was overwhelming, and all of this filth created perfect breeding grounds for rats. Rats were everywhere in medieval cities. They nested in walls, in roofs, in cellars, in warehouses. They fed on the abundant garbage and grain stores. A single city block might have hundreds of rats living in close proximity to humans, and each rat could carry dozens of fleas. Each flea could carry plague bacteria. Do the math. You're looking at thousands of potential infection sources in a single neighborhood. Water sources in cities were often contaminated. Public wells could be polluted by seepage from cesspits. Rivers served as sewers, water sources, and waste dumps simultaneously. Fountain systems, where they existed, often had stagnant sections where rats could drink. Even if the plague didn't spread through water, it didn't. The general health conditions from contaminated water weakened people's immune systems, making them more susceptible to the plague. Food storage in cities was problematic. Grain was stored in large communal warehouses that were perfect habitats for rats. Bakeries attracted rodents. Markets had food waste that drew rat populations. Every household's food stores could be contaminated by rats and their fleas. When you bought bread or grain in a city, you might be bringing plague vectors directly into your home. The social structure of cities made isolation nearly impossible. You couldn't avoid people. Your livelihood depended on daily interaction. Merchants needed customers. Craftsmen needed suppliers and buyers. Servants worked in others' homes. Everyone attended church. Everyone went to markets. Everyone drew water from public sources. The interconnection that made city life economically viable made it a disease transmission nightmare. If you're a wealthy merchant or nobleman living in a city, your best move is to leave immediately. Don't wait to see how bad it gets. Don't stay to protect your property. Don't convince yourself that surely it won't be as bad as the rumours say. Get out before the gates close, because they will close, and when they do, you're trapped inside with the disease. The decision to flee needs to happen fast. Once the plague is confirmed in your city, you have maybe a week before the situation becomes desperate. City authorities might close gates to prevent flight, believing, incorrectly, that keeping people in will contain the disease. Roads might become clogged with refugees, making travel dangerous. Prices for horses, carts, and supplies will skyrocket as everyone tries to leave at once. If you're wealthy, you likely have a country estate or know nobles who do. That's your destination, a manor house 10 or 20 miles from the nearest city, with its own agricultural land, wells, and minimal contact with travellers. Pack essentials, clothing, valuables, some food for the journey, medical supplies like clean linen bandages, herbs, and honey. Take trusted servants who are healthy and willing to isolate with you. Leave behind anyone showing any signs of illness, as cruel as that sounds. The journey itself is risky. You'll encounter other refugees on the road. Some might be infected. Avoid them. Take less travelled routes if possible. Don't stop at inns or taverns where you'd be exposed to travellers from multiple locations. Camp outdoors if weather permits. If you must seek shelter, choose isolated farmhouses and compensate the residents generously to house you separately from their family. The ideal destination? A remote rural estate, preferably one you own or have family connections to. You want isolation, self-sufficiency, and distance from trade routes. A manor house in the countryside with its own agricultural production, livestock, wells, and minimal contact with outsiders is your best bet. What makes a location ideal? First, distance from major roads and trade routes. The plague follows commerce. Major roads between cities are plague highways. Secondary roads are better. Isolated locations accessible only by small paths are best. You want to be somewhere that merchants, pilgrims, and travellers have no reason to pass through. Second, you need water independence. A private well, spring, or clean stream on your property means you never have to go to public water sources. This eliminates one reason to break isolation and one potential contamination source. Test your water source before the plague arrives. Make sure it's reliable year-round and adequate for your household's needs. Third, agricultural self-sufficiency. You need enough land under cultivation to feed your household for at least a year, preferably 2. This means grain fields, vegetable gardens, fruit trees, livestock for meat and dairy, chickens for eggs. You need storage facilities for grain and preserved foods. You need the tools and knowledge to maintain agricultural production with limited labour. Fourth, defensive capability. Your estate should be difficult to access without invitation. Walls, gates, or at least geographic barriers like rivers or forests. You'll need to defend against desperate refugees, bandits, or even neighbours who might try to take your resources by force. Medieval manor houses often had some defensive features: thick doors, small windows, sometimes a moat or wall. Use these advantages. But here's the problem. You're not alone in this thinking. Every wealthy person with the means to flee will have the same idea. The Italian writer Boccaccio documented this perfectly in the Decameron, describing how the rich abandoned cities while the poor had no choice but to stay and die. This mass exodus will create its own problems: refugees spreading disease, abandoned cities descending into chaos, and rural communities hostile to outsiders who might be carrying the plague. The roads out of cities during the plague become scenes of desperation and chaos. Carts piled with possessions, families on foot carrying children, wealthy merchants on horseback pushing past slower travellers. Arguments break out over road access. Price gouging is rampant. Tolls on private roads triple overnight. Horses sell for 10 times their normal value. Simple bread costs a week's wages. Some city dwellers who flee are already infected but don't know it yet. They're in the incubation period, feeling fine, but they're carrying plague bacteria that will manifest in a few days. These people spread the disease to rural areas that might have otherwise escaped. Villages that were isolated see plague arrive with wealthy urban refugees. This creates understandable hostility. Rural communities start refusing entry to city folk, sometimes violently. The abandoned cities left behind become nightmarish. With a significant portion of wealthy and capable people fled, the remaining population includes a disproportionate number of poor, elderly, sick, and those with no options. Social services collapse. Who collects waste when the collectors are dead or fled? Who maintains order when the city watchers abandon their posts? Who buries the dead when gravediggers refuse to work or die themselves? Crime increases in abandoned cities. Empty houses are looted. Food stores are raided. Violence erupts over scarce resources. Some areas see complete breakdown of law and order. Gangs of desperate people roam the streets. Fires start, whether from accident, arson, or unattended hearths, and spread unchecked because there's no one to fight them. Some city neighborhoods simply burn to the ground. If you can't flee to a rural estate, your second best option is a monastery or convent in an isolated location. Monastic communities that strictly limited outside contact and maintained rigorous hygiene practices for religious rather than medical reasons had better survival rates than the general population. Their structured daily routines, separation from secular society, and access to medical knowledge preserved in ancient texts gave them an edge. Monasteries offered several survival advantages. First, they were often built in isolated locations, on hilltops, in forests, on islands, in remote valleys. This geographic isolation provided natural disease protection. Second, they had self-sufficient economies with farmland, livestock, orchards and workshops producing everything needed for daily life. Third, they had discipline and structure that made implementing isolation protocols easier than in secular communities. The monastic lifestyle already included elements that helped prevent plague transmission. Monks and nuns often slept in individual cells rather than crowded dormitories. They had regular washing routines, though for spiritual purity rather than hygiene. They ate communal meals, but in organized, predictable ways that could be modified for safety. They had herb gardens with medicinal plants. They had libraries with texts on medicine, agriculture, and health. Some monasteries understood quarantine instinctively. They would refuse to accept new members during plague years, limit contact with the outside world, and isolate any member who showed symptoms. It wasn't based on germ theory, they didn't have that, but centuries of dealing with. Leprosy had taught religious communities the value of separation. The Christian Church's experience with leprosy was actually valuable preparation for plague response. Leper colonies had been established across Europe for centuries, operating on principles of strict separation between the sick and healthy. Leprosarium rules required isolation, restricted movement, and minimal contact with the outside world. These same principles, when applied to plague, actually work to reduce transmission. Monasteries that survived the plague best were those with strict enclosure rules. The Carthusian order, for example, required monks to live in individual cells, with minimal contact even with each other. They passed food through small hatches. They maintained silence. They had almost no interaction with the secular world. This extreme isolation, which seemed fanatical in normal times, became a survival advantage during the plague. However, not all monasteries survived well. Those in cities or along major trade routes were hit hard. Those that maintained active charitable work, caring for the sick and dying, lost huge numbers of members. Franciscan and Dominican friars, who lived among common people and ministered to the urban poor, had terrible death rates. Their dedication to serving others became their doom. If you're poor and can't leave the city, your options are grimmer. But there's still a strategy. Find the least populated area of town and create your own isolation. Abandoned buildings become available fast once the dying starts. Move to a house on the city's edge near the walls, away from markets and main streets. Avoid crowds like your life depends on it, because it does. For the urban poor, survival requires opportunism and ruthlessness. As wealthy residents flee and die, their homes become empty. Property rights become fuzzy when landlords are dead or gone and authorities have collapsed. You can move into better housing than you could normally afford. Look for stone buildings rather than wooden ones, better protection against rats. Find places with private wells or cisterns. Choose locations far from markets, churches, and other gathering places. The edge of the city near the walls is strategically better than the crowded centre. It's less densely populated. You have more space. You might even have access to small gardens or yards that wealthier residents maintained. You can sometimes access the countryside outside the walls for foraging or hunting if gates remain open, or if ways through walls that guards have abandoned. Create your isolation zone within the city. Choose your new location and seal yourself in as much as possible. Block off your street if you can, creating a barrier that keeps outsiders away. Team up with a few trusted neighbours who are still healthy to create a small survival community. Share resources. and security while maintaining distance from the chaos elsewhere in the city. One historical example worth noting: the village of Ayam in England. When plague arrived in 1665, a later outbreak, the villagers made an extraordinary choice. They quarantined themselves, refusing to let anyone leave or enter the village to prevent spreading the disease to neighbouring communities. About half the village died, but they successfully contained the outbreak. That level of community cooperation was rare, but it shows what's possible. The Ayam story is remarkable because it was a collective decision made with full knowledge of the likely cost. The village rector convinced the population that their Christian duty was to protect neighbouring villages, even if it meant their own deaths. They drew a boundary around the village and enforced it strictly. Food and supplies were left at the boundary by outsiders. No one crossed the line in either direction for over a year. The death toll in Ayam was horrific. 260 of the approximately 350 residents died. Whole families were wiped out. The village tailor, who had received the infected cloth bundle that started the outbreak, lost his entire family. But their sacrifice worked. No neighbouring villages were infected. The plague was contained to Ayam alone. It's a powerful example of how quarantine can work even at terrible cost. Of course, Ayam's approach required a level of community solidarity and acceptance of death that was unusual. Most communities, when plague arrived, saw every person for themselves scrambles to survive. Cooperation broke down. Trust evaporated. The social bonds that held communities together dissolved under the pressure of mass death and terror. The geographic strategy matters more than almost anything else. The plague spread through human contact and trade. Distance equals survival. Isolation equals survival. The moment you choose to stay in a crowded city, when you have the option to leave, you've already lost. But even if you can't leave the city entirely, creating distance matters. Distance from crowds, distance from the sick, distance from travellers, distance from markets and trade. Every metre you can put between yourself and potential infection sources improves your odds. The plague doesn't leap across empty space. It requires vectors, fleas, coughing patients, contaminated items. Remove yourself from those vectors and you remove the disease's ability to reach you. Chapter 3. Implementing medieval quarantine. Your isolation protocol. You've made it to your rural refuge, or you've secured an isolated position in the city. Now comes the hard part. Maintaining strict isolation protocols that will seem absolutely insane to everyone around you. Here's your rule. Nobody gets in without a 40-day quarantine period. Yes, 40 days. That's where the word quarantine comes from. 40 giorni, Italian for 40 days. Venice and other Italian city-states implemented this for ships during the plague years, and it actually worked. The incubation period for bubonic plague is 2 to 6 days, and for pneumonic plague it's 1 to 4 days. So 40 days is more than enough to ensure someone isn't carrying the disease. The Venetian quarantine system was remarkably sophisticated for medieval times. Ships arriving in Venice during plague years were required to anchor at designated islands in the lagoon, San Lazzaro Nuovo and later Lazzaretto Nuovo. The ship's crew and cargo would remain isolated there for 40 days before being allowed into the city. If anyone aboard showed symptoms during this period, the clock reset. Guards enforced the quarantine with threat of death for violations. This system worked because it recognized, even without understanding disease transmission scientifically, that isolation prevents spread. If a ship had plague aboard, it would become apparent within 40 days. Sick crew would develop symptoms and either recover or die. The quarantine period was long enough to ensure that no hidden infections remained. Ships that completed the quarantine period, clean, were truly safe. Other Italian cities adopted similar measures. Dubrovnik, Ragusa, established a quarantine system in 1377, actually before Venice. Marseille, Genoa, and Pisa followed suit. The concept of quarantine, isolating potentially infected people for a set period before allowing them into the general population, was one of medieval medicine's few actually effective innovations. This sounds simple until you remember that in medieval society, hospitality isn't just expected, it's a moral and religious obligation. Turning away travellers, family members, or friends will mark you as cruel and unchristian. People will think you've lost your mind. They'll accuse you of cowardice. They might even try to force their way in. Medieval hospitality culture was deeply ingrained. The Bible commanded feeding the hungry, sheltering the stranger, and caring for the sick. Monasteries had a duty to provide hospitality to travellers. Noble houses were expected to offer food and lodging to guests. Even peasants would share their meagre resources with visitors. Refusing hospitality was a serious moral failing, potentially a sin that would endanger your soul. This creates intense social pressure against isolation. When your sister arrives at your gate fleeing a plague-stricken city with her children, and you refuse to let her in immediately, you're violating every social norm. You're choosing your own safety over family duty. You're acting like a selfish coward while your family members are desperate and terrified. The guilt and social condemnation are enormous. Religious authorities often oppose strict isolation measures. Many priests taught that plague was God's punishment for sin, and the appropriate response was prayer, penance, and acceptance of God's will. Fleeing or isolating suggested lack of faith. Caring for sick family members was a religious duty. Turning away the desperate violated Christian charity. Priests who preached these messages often died, ministering to plague victims, but their teachings persisted. You have to be absolutely ruthless about this. No exceptions. Not for family fleeing the city, not for the local priest, not for neighbours begging for shelter. Every person who enters your space without proper quarantine could bring the plague with them, and one infected flea or one pneumonic plague victim is all it takes to doom everyone you're protecting. The psychological toll of this ruthlessness is severe. You'll watch people you love suffer and maintain your refusal. You'll hear children crying outside your gate and not open it. You'll know that your neighbour's entire family is dying, and you'll do nothing to help. You'll be called heartless, evil, damned, and you'll have to accept that judgment because the alternative is death. Some historical accounts describe families torn apart by these decisions, parents refusing to admit their own children, spouses separated by quarantine rules, one stuck in a plague city, while the other waited safely in the country. Siblings who never forgave each other for refusing shelter. The plague didn't just kill people, it destroyed relationships and communities. If someone you know arrives seeking refuge, here's your protocol. Set up a quarantine structure at least 100 yards from your main dwelling. Could be a barn, could be a cottage, could be a tent. They stay there for 40 days with food and water delivered at a distance. No physical contact, no sharing of items. If they develop symptoms, they stay isolated. If they die, you don't touch the body. Burial happens where they fell, or you burn everything. The quarantine structure needs to be truly separate. Not a room in your house, not a connected building, a completely separate space where you can maintain real distance. 100 yards isn't arbitrary. It's far enough that you can't easily have close conversation, that respiratory droplets from a coughing patient won't reach you, that you're forced to maintain distance in all interactions. Setting up this structure requires planning. You need a weatherproof shelter adequate for 40 days. In summer, a tent or simple lean-to might work. In winter, you need real walls and a heat source, but one that won't create fire risk if left unattended. You need a system for delivering food and water without contact, maybe a rope and pulley system, or a dead drop location where you leave items and retreat before the quarantine person retrieves them. The quarantine person needs basic supplies: bedding, chamber pot, water bucket, eating utensils, clothing. All of these become contaminated and must be destroyed or thoroughly cleaned after the quarantine period. You cannot reuse them in your household without intense cleaning, boiling cloth items, soaking metal in vinegar, disposing of anything wooden or porous. Communication during quarantine happens at a distance. You can shout back and forth, you can leave written notes if both parties are literate, but no close conversation, no physical comfort, no normal human interaction. For 40 days, the quarantine person lives in isolation, waiting to see if they sicken or remain healthy. This is going to feel monstrous. You're going to watch people you know suffering and refuse to help them directly. You're going to turn away children. You're going to have to threaten force against desperate people. But here's the thing. Compassion without wisdom is just a faster way to die. Every medieval person who took in a sick family member and nursed them personally usually died alongside them. The data bears this out. Contemporary accounts consistently describe whole families dying together within days of each other. One person would fall ill, the family would gather to care for them. Within a week, everyone would be infected. Within 2 weeks, the entire household would be dead. This pattern repeated thousands of times across Europe. The impulse to care for sick loved ones, while morally admirable, was practically suicidal. Some families made the opposite choice and survived. There are accounts of people isolating sick family members in separate buildings, providing food at a distance, and refusing physical contact. These families had better survival rates, but they carried guilt for the rest of their lives. Many described feeling like they had murdered their own relatives through neglect. The psychological cost of survival was sometimes almost unbearable. Inside your isolation zone, you maintain strict hygiene protocols. Everyone washes hands frequently in running water, or water that's been boiled. You don't share eating utensils, cups, or personal items. You keep living spaces clean and well ventilated. You sleep separately rather than piling into one room like typical medieval practice. Hand washing might seem basic, but it was not common practice in medieval Europe. People generally didn't wash their hands before eating or after using the privy. Water was often scarce, and washing was seen as unnecessary or even unhealthy. Some medieval medical texts suggested that bathing opened the pores and allowed bad air to enter the body, making you more susceptible to disease. But you know better. Washing hands, especially after any contact with potentially contaminated materials, removes bacteria. Soap, if you have it, is better than water alone. If you don't have soap, ash and water creates a basic cleaning agent. Scrub thoroughly, especially under fingernails and between fingers. Dry on clean cloth that's washed regularly. Ventilation is also contrary to medieval instinct. The miasma theory suggested keeping windows closed to prevent bad air from entering. But you know that fresh air circulation actually reduces disease transmission, particularly for airborne pneumonic plague. Keep windows open when weather permits. Create cross breezes. Don't trap stale air indoors. This also helps with the psychological burden of isolation. Seeing sunlight and feeling fresh air improves mental state. The separate sleeping arrangement is crucial for disease control, but difficult to implement. Medieval families typically slept together for warmth. Even wealthy households often had multiple people per bed. Space was limited and heat was precious in cold months. But shared beds mean shared fleas. One infected flea in the bed can bite multiple people in a night. You need separate sleeping spaces and separate bedding that's washed frequently in hot water. You wage war on rats and fleas. This is crucial. You keep all food in sealed containers that rats can't access. You eliminate any standing water where rats might drink. You encourage natural rat predators, cats, weasels, owls. Medieval people actually killed cats during the plague. thinking they spread disease, which only made the rat problem worse. You do the opposite. The cat-killing phenomenon was one of the plague's many tragic ironies. Some people associated cats with witchcraft and believed they were agents of the devil spreading plague. Others thought all animals could transmit the disease and killed pets indiscriminately. The result was fewer predators keeping rat populations in check, leading to more rats, more fleas, and more plague transmission. A perfectly counterproductive response based on superstition rather than observation. You actively recruit cats to your estate if you don't have enough. Offer food to attract strays. Protect them from harm. Let them breed. A good mouser can kill dozens of rats per month. Multiple cats working your estate can significantly reduce the rodent population. Watch how cats behave. They'll often hunt in areas with high rat activity, showing you where problems exist. Other predators help too. Owls and hawks hunt rats, especially in agricultural areas and barns. Don't disturb their nests. Provide roosting sites. Weasels and ferrets are fearless rat hunters that can follow prey into burrows and walls. Some estates keep them semi-domestically for pest control. Dogs, while not primary rat hunters, can catch and kill rats they encounter, and their presence can deter rodent activity. For fleas, you use herbs that actually work as repellents: pennyroyal, lavender, mint, and rosemary. You make sachets to keep in your bedding and clothes. You bathe regularly, which is unusual for medieval standards but necessary. You change and wash your clothes frequently in hot water. You keep your living space swept and clean. Pennyroyal contains pelargonium, which genuinely repels fleas. Lavender has linalool and linaloyl acetate, which insects avoid. These aren't perfect flea preventatives, but they do provide some deterrent effect. Placing sachets of dried herbs in bedding, clothing chests, and living areas creates an environment fleas are less likely to infest. It won't eliminate the risk, but it reduces it. Bathing once a week or more, radical for medieval times, removes fleas from your body before they can bite and transmit disease. Hot water kills fleas at all life stages. Washing your entire body with soap or a soap substitute removes eggs and larvae from your skin and hair. It's uncomfortable in winter, but it's necessary. Clothing needs to be changed and washed far more frequently than medieval norms. Ideally, you have multiple sets of clothes and rotate them. Wear one set for a few days, then wash it in very hot water while wearing a different set. The heat kills fleas. Boiling is better than just hot washing. Sun drying also helps. UV light damages flea eggs and larvae. Alternatively, you can heat clothes in an oven or over fire if boiling isn't practical. Keep living spaces meticulously clean. Sweep floors daily. Remove any organic debris where fleas might breed. Shake out and beat bedding regularly, preferably outdoors where dislodged fleas fall away from living spaces. Wash floors with water and vinegar or other cleaning solutions. Medieval people typically cleaned sporadically at best. You need to clean constantly. If you must interact with the outside world for supplies, you do it through dead drops. Money goes into a bucket of vinegar at a distance. Supplies are left, you wait an hour, then collect them. No face-to-face contact. Some Italian cities actually implemented this system at town gates during plague years. Money went into vinegar baths. Goods were transferred without contact. The vinegar bath for money was based on the theory that vinegar purified things. Medieval people thought acidic substances could cleanse corruption. They didn't understand disinfection scientifically, but vinegar does have some antimicrobial properties. More importantly, the ritual created distance. Leaving money in vinegar meant no hand-to-hand exchange. Waiting an hour before retrieving goods meant no close contact with the deliverer. Dead drop systems require coordination, but not conversation. You establish a location at the boundary of your property. You ring a bell or raise a flag to signal you've left money. The supplier approaches, places goods, takes the money and departs. They signal completion, another bell, another flag. You wait until they're well clear, at least 30 minutes, preferably an hour, before approaching to collect your supplies. When you retrieve supplies, you treat everything as potentially contaminated. Cloth bags are emptied and their contents transferred to your own containers. The bags are either destroyed or left to air out for several days before reuse. Food items with non-porous surfaces can be wiped with vinegar. Porous items like bread or cloth are left in sunlight and air for a day before bringing them into your living space. These precautions may seem excessive, but excessive caution is the only caution that works. You also prepare for psychological isolation. Humans are social creatures, and you're about to spend months or years with extremely limited social contact. Medieval people didn't have books, entertainment, or communication technology. You're facing profound loneliness. Having a small, trusted group of people in your isolation zone helps, but you need to prepare mentally for what this level of separation does to your psyche. The psychological challenges of isolation are as dangerous as the physical disease. Human beings evolved as social creatures. We need interaction, touch, conversation, community. Removing all of that creates psychological pressure that can lead to depression, anxiety, paranoia, or complete mental breakdown. Medieval people had no understanding of mental health, no coping strategies, no therapeutic interventions. Loneliness in isolation manifests in different ways. Some people become depressed, losing motivation to maintain survival activities. They stop eating properly, stop cleaning, stop caring for themselves. Others become anxious and hypervigilant, seeing threat everywhere, unable to relax or sleep. Some develop paranoia, believing their isolation companions are secretly infected or plotting against them. Others hallucinate from sensory deprivation and lack of stimulation. The absence of touch is particularly difficult. Human beings need physical contact. Infants who don't receive touch fail to thrive. Adults who are touch-deprived experience increased stress hormones, decreased immune function, and psychological distress. In isolation, you might go months without touching another human being. This deprivation creates a constant background stress that wears on mental resilience. Having a small group in your isolation zone provides some protection against the worst psychological effects. Conversation, even limited interaction, shared activities. These maintain some semblance of normal human social experience. But you need to be careful about who you isolate with. Conflicts arise easily in confined situations with limited resources and constant stress. Personality conflicts that would be minor annoyances in normal times can escalate into serious problems when you can't escape each other. Choose your isolation companions carefully. You want people who are emotionally stable, cooperative, and have useful skills. Avoid those prone to panic, conflict, or impulsive behavior. You'll be stuck with these people for months or years. Their psychological stability is as important as their physical health. A mentally unstable person in your isolation group can compromise everyone's survival through irrational actions or inability to maintain protocols. The people who survived the Black Death in the highest numbers were those who could maintain this kind of strict isolation for extended periods. It wasn't natural, it wasn't comfortable, it went against every social instinct. But it worked. The historical record bears this out. Isolated monasteries had better survival rates. Remote estates that maintained strict quarantine had better survival rates. Individuals who fled early to isolated locations and stayed there had better survival rates. The common factor was physical separation from disease vectors and the discipline to maintain that separation despite every pressure to break it. Surviving the Black Death required not just knowing what to do, but having the resources to do it, the discipline to stick with it, and the psychological resilience to endure the isolation. Many people had one or two of these factors, but not all three. those who had all three gave themselves the best possible chance. The plague still might kill you. Luck always plays a role, but you'd have done everything humanly possible to survive. Chapter 4. Recognizing and responding to symptoms. Early. Despite your best efforts at isolation, you need to prepare for the possibility that the plague reaches your household. Early recognition of symptoms could save your life. Here's what you're watching for. Sudden fever and chills, usually appearing 2 to 6 days after infection. Extreme fatigue that makes it difficult to stand. Headaches that feel like your skull is splitting. And then the telltale sign, swelling in the lymph nodes. These buboes typically appear in the groin first, then armpits, then neck. They're painful, hot to the touch, and grow rapidly. The progression of symptoms follows a predictable pattern that you need to recognize immediately. Day 1 might just feel like a bad cold, fatigue, mild headache, general malaise. You might dismiss it. Don't. In a plague environment, any unexplained illness should be treated as potential plague until proven otherwise. This is where most people fail. They delay isolation because they hope it's just a normal illness. By day 2, the fever spikes dramatically. You're talking about temperatures of 103 to 105 degrees Fahrenheit. The infected person feels like they're burning from the inside. They alternate between sweating profusely and shaking with chills so violent they can barely hold a cup. The headache intensifies to the point where light and sound become painful. Moving hurts. Thinking becomes difficult. This is when the buboes usually start to appear. The buboes are your definitive diagnostic sign. They start as tender spots. In the lymph nodes, most commonly in the groin if the flea bite was on the leg, in the armpit if the bite was on the arm or torso, in the neck if the bite was on the head or upper body. Within hours, these tender spots swell into hard, painful lumps. By the end of day 2 or beginning of day 3, they can be the size of a chicken egg or even larger. The pain of buboes is excruciating. The swelling presses on nerves and surrounding tissue. The skin stretches tight over the mass, sometimes turning dark purple or black. The patient cannot move the affected limb without agony. If the bubo is in the groin, walking is nearly impossible. If in the armpit, raising the arm is torture. If in the neck, even turning the head causes pain. The moment someone in your household shows these symptoms, you move them to isolation immediately. Not tomorrow, not after you see how they feel in the morning. Right now. Set up a separate space as far from others as possible. They get their own dishes, their own chamber pot, their own everything. One person becomes their designated caretaker. Ideally someone who's already survived the plague, if you have anyone like that. The isolation room should be the most remote space available. If you have a separate outbuilding, use that. If not, use the room farthest from where healthy people sleep and spend time. Seal the room as much as possible. Stuff cloth under doors, keep windows closed if pneumonic symptoms develop. The sick person's waste, dishes, and personal items never leave that room. Everything stays contained. Designating a single caretaker minimizes exposure. If multiple people rotate through caregiving, you're exposing multiple people unnecessarily. One person takes the risk. This is a horrible choice to have to make, essentially deciding who will likely die along with the patient. But it's the rational survival strategy for the group. The caretaker should be the person with the least critical survival skills for the group, or the person most willing to accept the risk. Why someone who survived? Because plague survivors gained immunity. If you survived bubonic plague once, you weren't getting it again. This was observed during the Black Death. Plague survivors could walk among the sick and dying without fear. They became invaluable as caregivers, corpse handlers, and nurses. If you're a plague survivor reading this, congratulations. You're now the most valuable person in your community. Plague immunity was one of the few scientifically valid observations medieval people made about the disease. they noticed that people who recovered from bubonic plague almost never got it again. Some survivors made careers of it, becoming paid caregivers, gravediggers, or plague nurses precisely because they could work without risk. Cities would sometimes hire plague survivors to maintain basic services during outbreaks. The immunity wasn't perfect. There are rare documented cases of reinfection, but it was reliable, enough that survivors could operate with confidence. This created a strange social dynamic where plague survivors became valuable in ways they never had been before. Poor survivors could suddenly command high wages for dangerous work. Some used this to escape poverty and build new lives. For the patient, treatment in medieval times was limited but not hopeless. The key is supporting the body's immune system while it fights the infection. Keep them hydrated, constant water or weak ale. Feed them if they'll eat, focusing on broths, soft bread, and easily digestible foods. Keep fever down with cool water compresses. Hydration is critical and difficult. High fevers cause sweating and fluid loss. The patient needs to drink constantly. Small sips if they can't manage large amounts. Water is best. Weak ale, with low alcohol content, was commonly used in medieval times because brewing killed waterborne pathogens. Broths from boiled meat or vegetables provide both hydration and some nutrition. If the patient can't drink on their own, you need to help them sip frequently. Dehydration will kill them faster than the plague in some cases. Watch for signs of severe dehydration, dry mouth and lips, sunken eyes, dark urine, confusion. If they reach this state, their chances plummet even if their body might otherwise fight off the infection. Fever management helps the patient feel better and may improve survival odds. The fever itself is part of the immune response. Higher body temperature helps fight infection, so you don't want to eliminate it entirely. But extremely high fevers can cause seizures, brain damage, and death. Cool water compresses on the forehead, neck, wrists, and ankles can bring temperature down a few degrees. Change the compresses frequently as they warm up. Food is less critical in the short term than water, but nutrition supports immune function. If the patient can eat, offer nutritious options. Meat broths provide protein. Bread soaked in broth is easy to swallow. Honey has antimicrobial properties and provides quick energy. Avoid foods that are difficult to digest. The patient's body is already under stress. The buboes themselves present a decision point. Medieval doctors would sometimes lance them to drain the pus, and this actually could help. If the bubo ruptures naturally or is drained, it releases pressure and removes some of the bacterial load. But you need to be extremely careful. If you lance a bubo, you're creating an open wound that can spread infection. The pus and blood are absolutely crawling with plague bacteria. Anyone performing this procedure needs to cover their mouth and nose, wash thoroughly afterward, and burn any cloths used. Lancing a bubo is a calculated risk. On one hand, draining it can provide relief from the intense pressure and pain. It can reduce the bacterial load in the lymph node. Some medical texts from the period suggest that patients whose buboes ruptured or were successfully drained had better survival rates than those whose buboes remained hard and unruptured. On the other hand, you're creating an infection risk. Medieval surgical instruments weren't sterile. The procedure itself causes additional tissue damage. If not done correctly, you could spread the infection to the bloodstream or cause secondary infections in the wound. The pain of lancing without anesthesia is almost unbearable. Imagine cutting into an already agonizingly tender swollen lymph node. If you decide to lance a bubo, wait until it's ripe, soft and clearly full of fluid, not hard and solid. The bubo should be at its maximum size and the skin over it thin and stretched. Clean the area as well as possible with water or vinegar. Use a sharp knife heated in fire to sterilize it. Make a quick, clean incision. Drain the pus thoroughly. Pack the wound with clean cloth or honey. Watch for signs of worsening infection. The person doing the lancing must protect themselves. Cover your nose and mouth with multiple layers of cloth. Don't let any pus or blood contact your skin. Wear gloves if you have them, or wrap your hands in cloth. The patient will likely scream from pain and could cough or spit. Keep your face away from their face. After the procedure, wash your hands and arms thoroughly with soap and water. Burn the cloths used in the procedure. Burn the pus-soaked bandages. Leave nothing that could transmit infection. Some medieval treatments were actually harmful. Bloodletting weakened patients when they needed strength. Certain poultices could cause additional infections, but some herbal remedies had genuine benefits. Garlic has natural antibacterial properties. Honey has been used for wound treatment since ancient times and actually works. Clean water and rest, the basics, matter more than elaborate treatments. Garlic contains allicin, which has demonstrated antibacterial effects. While it's not strong enough to cure plague by itself, it can provide marginal support to the immune system. Crushing fresh garlic and having the patient eat it, or making garlic-infused broths, might provide minor benefits. At minimum, it doesn't harm, unlike bloodletting. Honey is remarkable for wound care. It's hygroscopic, meaning it draws moisture out of bacterial cells and kills them. It creates a barrier against further infection. It has some natural antibacterial compounds. Ancient Egyptian and Greek physicians used honey for wound treatment, and modern research has confirmed it works. If you've lanced a bubo, or if the patient has any open sores, honey applications can actually help prevent secondary infections. Rest is perhaps the most important treatment you can offer. The body needs all its resources focused on fighting the infection. Physical activity diverts energy away from immune function. Keep the patient lying down, keep them comfortable as possible, minimize stress and exertion. Their only job is to breathe, drink, and let their immune system work. If symptoms progress to pneumonic plague, coughing, bloody sputum, chest pain, difficulty breathing, your calculus changes. The survival rate drops to nearly zero. The patient becomes highly contagious through airborne transmission. At this point, the caretaker needs to make an agonizing choice. Maintain distance and let the patient die alone, or stay close and likely catch the disease yourself. Pneumonic plague progression is rapid and terrible. The coughing starts within a day or two of the bacteria reaching the lungs. At first, it's a dry cough, irritating and persistent. Then it becomes productive, bringing up sputum. The sputum quickly turns pink, then red with blood. The patient struggles to breathe as their lungs fill with fluid and inflammatory cells. They feel like they're drowning. The patient's breathing becomes labored and wheezing. They gasp for air. Their lips and fingernails turn blue from oxygen deprivation. They panic from the sensation of suffocating. This panic makes breathing even harder, creating a vicious cycle. Some patients become so desperate for air that they try to sit upright or lean forward, finding any position that might help them breathe. At this stage, the patient is essentially a biological weapon. Every cough expels thousands of bacteria-laden droplets into the air. These droplets can travel several feet and remain suspended for minutes. Anyone in the same room is inhaling plague bacteria with every breath. The risk of transmission approaches 100% with prolonged exposure in an enclosed space. There's no good answer here. Many medieval people chose to stay with their dying loved ones, which is why whole families would be wiped out within days of each other. The more strategic choice, the survival choice, is to minimize contact. Provide water and comfort from a distance. Cover your mouth and nose if you must enter the room. Spend as little time as possible in enclosed spaces with them. The moral weight of this decision is crushing. You're essentially abandoning someone you love in their final hours, when they're most terrified and suffering. They'll call out for you. They'll beg for comfort. They'll die alone, scared and feeling abandoned. You'll carry that guilt for the rest of your life. But if you stay with them, you almost certainly die too, and then you've accomplished nothing except adding one more corpse to the pile. Some medieval writers described hearing the cries of dying family members and having to steel themselves against responding. Parents listening to their children die in the next room, spouses hearing their partners calling their names. The psychological torture of choosing survival over compassion left scars on survivors that never healed. Septicemic plague, the form where the bacteria overwhelms the bloodstream, was essentially a death sentence. Tissue death, organ failure, and shock followed rapidly. If you see blackening of extremities, you know the patient is in final stages. Septicemic plague represents complete systemic failure. The bacteria multiply so rapidly in the bloodstream that they release toxins faster than the body can process them. These toxins cause blood vessels to leak and clot simultaneously. Tiny clots form throughout the body, cutting off blood flow to extremities and organs. This is why fingers, toes, nose and ears turn black. The tissue is dying from lack of blood. The patient in septicemic plague often goes into shock. Blood pressure drops. The heart races, trying to maintain circulation but can't keep up. The patient becomes confused and disoriented as their brain doesn't get enough oxygen. Kidneys fail, stopping urine production. The liver fails, causing yellowing of skin and eyes. Multiple organ systems collapse in cascade. Death from septicemic plague is relatively quick once it reaches this stage, usually within 24 hours of the blackening appearing. There's nothing to be done. No medieval treatment could address systemic organ failure. Even if you could somehow support one failing organ, 3 others would be failing simultaneously. The patient slips into unconsciousness and dies. Here's the brutal truth. Most medieval people who nursed their sick family members died alongside them. The survival strategy is clinical detachment. You provide care from a distance, you protect yourself first, and you accept that some people can't be saved. It's heartless by medieval standards, where family duty was everything. But it's how you survive. The statistics are stark. Studies of plague mortality patterns show that when one household member contracted plague, the entire household was at severe risk. If family members nursed the patient directly, household mortality often exceeded 80%. Families that isolated the sick member immediately and minimized contact had mortality rates closer to 30 to 40%. Still terrible, but dramatically better. Clinical detachment doesn't mean you don't care. It means you separate emotional impulses from survival decisions. You can grieve later, you can feel guilt later. Right now, in the moment, you make the hard choices that maximize survival odds. You protect the healthy over comforting the dying. You maintain protocols even when they seem cruel. You survive so that the family line continues, even if individual family members don't. Documentation from plague survivors consistently shows that those who survived took precautions that seemed cruel to their contemporaries, refusing to touch the sick, isolating symptomatic family members, fleeing rather than staying to care for loved ones. They were called cowards and sinners, but they lived. The social judgment was severe. Communities remembered who fled and who stayed. Survivors who had abandoned family members or refused to help neighbors faced ostracism and condemnation. Some were formally shunned by churches. Others faced legal consequences for abandoning dependents. The label of coward could follow someone for life. But here's the thing. The people who made those judgments were often dead within months. The survivors, the cowards, were the ones who rebuilt society. Their genes continued. Their families survived. Their ruthless choices, however morally condemned, were evolutionarily successful. History was written by survivors, and survivors were those who prioritized survival over social approval. This creates a strange dynamic where the right choice by medieval moral standards, staying with your sick family, nursing them personally, accepting God's will, was the wrong choice for survival. And the wrong choice by medieval standards, isolation, refusal to help, prioritizing self-preservation, was the right choice for survival. The plague inverted the moral calculus and rewarded behaviors that normal times would condemn. Chapter 5. Securing food and water without exposure. Isolation only works if you can sustain it. That means solving the food and water problem without breaking quarantine. If you're on a rural estate, you have the best possible situation: agricultural self-sufficiency. Your manor produces grain, vegetables, livestock, and dairy. You have wells or springs for fresh water. You can theoretically survive for years without outside contact. But there's a catch. You need labour to maintain agricultural production. Medieval farming was labour-intensive. Ploughing, planting, harvesting, animal husbandry. All of this required lots of workers. And the plague is about to devastate your labour force. A typical medieval manor might have 20 to 50 peasant families working the land. They'd plant wheat, barley, oats and rye in rotation. They'd maintain vegetable gardens. They'd tend pigs, cattle, sheep and chickens. They'd cut hay for winter fodder. They'd repair fences, buildings and tools. They'd process grain into flour, milk into cheese, meat into preserved forms. The amount of constant labour required to maintain a self-sufficient estate was enormous. When the plague hits, that labour force collapses. Half of your workers might die in the first wave. Others will flee to find safer locations or better opportunities elsewhere. Some will be too sick to work, even if they survive. Suddenly you're looking at trying to maintain the same agricultural output with a fraction of the workforce. The immediate crisis is the current growing season. If it's spring or summer when plague arrives, you have crops in the ground that need tending. Grain fields need weeding, or yields plummet. Vegetables need watering and harvesting. Livestock need daily feeding and care. If you abandon these tasks, you lose the entire year's production, which means starvation next winter regardless of whether you survive the plague. Here's your strategy. Before the plague hits, stockpile grain. Medieval yields weren't great, maybe 3-to-1 or 4-to-1 return on seed planted. But if you can store grain from a good harvest, you can survive a year or more even if agricultural production drops. Store it in sealed containers to keep rats out. Keep multiple storage locations in case one becomes compromised. Grain storage is more complex than just putting wheat in a bag. You need to keep it dry. Moisture causes rot and mold that destroys the grain and can make it poisonous. You need to keep it cool. Heat accelerates spoilage. You need to keep it away from rats and insects that will eat it or contaminate it with waste. You need to protect it from theft by desperate neighbours or bandits. The best storage method is large clay jars or wooden barrels sealed with wax or pitch. Store these in a cool, dry cellar if you have one. Elevate them off the ground on stone or wood platforms to prevent moisture seepage. Check regularly for signs of pest infestation or spoilage. Rotate your stock using older grain first while it's still good. How much grain do you need? A single person requires roughly 400 to 500 pounds of grain per year for basic caloric needs. That's about 1 to 1.5 pounds of grain per day, which becomes bread, porridge, or ale. For a household of 10 people, you're looking at 4,000 to 5,000 pounds of grain for 1 year. For 2 years, double it. That's multiple tons of grain you need to successfully store and protect. Medieval estates would typically try to keep 1 year's supply in reserve for bad harvest years. If you're preparing for plague, you want 2 years if possible. The first year might see disrupted production as workers die or flee. The second year, you're rebuilding with whoever survived. Having that buffer means you're not desperate and can make rational decisions rather than survival-driven ones. For fresh food, focus on crops that require minimal labour. Root vegetables like turnips and carrots can largely be left in the ground. Fruit trees produce without daily attention. Chickens and geese require less care than cattle or pigs. Scale down to what you can actually manage with limited workers. Turnips and carrots are survival crops. Plant them in spring, weed once or twice during the growing season, and harvest in fall. They store well in cool cellars for months. They provide solid nutrition. They're nearly idiot-proof to grow. In crisis conditions, you want crops that are forgiving of neglect and still produce reasonable yields. Fruit trees are even better for low-maintenance food production. An established orchard requires almost no labour. Trees bloom, set fruit, and produce without human intervention. Apple, pear, plum and cherry trees all do well in most of Europe. In late summer and fall you harvest what you need and preserve the excess, drying fruit, making preserves with honey, or pressing apples into cider that stores well. Chickens are ideal livestock for reduced labour conditions. They forage for much of their own food if allowed to range freely. They eat kitchen scraps and pests. They produce eggs daily. They reproduce readily. You need to protect them from predators and provide some supplemental feed, but the labour requirement is minimal compared to large livestock. Geese are similarly low maintenance. They graze on grass and weeds. They're aggressive enough to defend themselves against many predators. They produce large eggs. Their meat is rich and fatty. They require almost no housing. They're hardy enough to survive outdoors year-round in most climates. Cattle and pigs are more labour-intensive. Cattle need daily milking if you're maintaining dairy production. They need pasture management, hay for winter, shelter in harsh weather. Pigs need feeding and secure pens. They're escape artists and destructive if they get loose. In a reduced labour situation, you might reduce your herds, keeping only essential breeding stock and slaughtering the rest for preserved meat. Hunting and foraging become more important. Game populations will actually increase as human populations collapse. Forests become less heavily hunted. Deer, rabbit, wild boar all become more accessible. Fish populations in rivers and streams rebound. If you have skills in hunting and fishing, you're in good shape. The collapse of human population creates a temporary abundance of wildlife. Without hunting pressure, deer populations explode. Wild boar multiply in forests. Rabbits become numerous in abandoned fields. Birds thrive without human predation. For survivors who can hunt, this represents a significant food source that doesn't require agricultural labour. Hunting in medieval times typically required noble privilege. Commoners weren't allowed to hunt in forests owned by nobility. But during the plague, these restrictions break down. Nobles are dead or too busy surviving to enforce hunting laws. Game wardens abandon their posts. Survivors hunt wherever they find game. Social class be damned. It's one of the ways plague breaks down feudal restrictions. Fishing requires less skill than hunting and can provide protein regularly. Medieval rivers and streams had healthy fish populations: trout, salmon, pike, perch, eels. Simple techniques like basket traps or fishing lines with bone hooks can catch fish without much effort. Set a trap in the evening, check it in the morning. Even children can learn to fish, making it a way to contribute to household food production. Foraging for wild plants supplements agricultural production. Wild greens, mushrooms, berries, nuts, forests and fields provide free food if you know what to look for. Medieval peasants regularly forage to supplement their diets. Knowledge of which plants are edible and which are poisonous is critical. Many plants look similar, and mistaking poisonous hemlock for wild carrot can kill you just as surely as plague. For water, you need a clean, private source. If you're using a well, that's ideal. But if you're drawing from a river or stream, you need to be aware of contamination. Plague victims upstream might pollute the water supply. Boil drinking water when possible. Medieval people didn't understand waterborne disease, but they did notice that sometimes water made people sick, so they often drank ale. Instead, the brewing process killed pathogens. A private well is the gold standard for water security during plague. It's isolated from surface contamination. It doesn't require leaving your property. It can't be easily poisoned or controlled by others. If your estate has a well, maintain it carefully. Keep it covered to prevent debris and pests from falling in. Draw water with clean buckets. Test the water regularly by smell and taste for any changes that might indicate contamination. If you're drawing from a stream or river, location matters. Draw water upstream of any human settlements. The higher in the watershed you can get, the cleaner the water. Avoid areas where livestock graze or where you've seen animal carcasses. Fast-flowing water is generally safer than stagnant water. Boiling water kills virtually all pathogens. Bring water to a hard boil for several minutes. Let it cool before drinking. This requires fuel, wood for fires, but it's worth the resource expenditure to ensure water safety. Boiled water tastes flat because dissolved gases escape, but you can improve the taste by pouring it back and forth between containers to re-aerate it. Ale consumption in medieval times wasn't primarily about alcohol. It was about safe hydration. The brewing process involved boiling water, which killed pathogens. The resulting weak ale, often 1 to 3% alcohol, was safer than untreated water. Brewing was a household skill, typically women's work. Maintaining brewing capability during plague isolation ensures safe drinking water, even if your primary water source becomes questionable. In cities, the food situation is more desperate. Normal supply chains break down as the plague spreads. Farmers stop bringing goods to market. Merchants flee or die. Bakeries close. Suddenly food becomes scarce. Urban food systems depend on daily or weekly deliveries from surrounding countryside. Farmers bring grain, vegetables, meat and dairy to city markets. Merchants import goods from distant regions. Bakers produce bread daily from grain stocks. The system works smoothly in normal times, but it's fragile. When plague disrupts any link in the chain, the whole system fails. Farmers stop making market trips because they fear entering plague-ridden cities. Why risk exposure to sell vegetables when you might die within the week? Some are too sick to work or have lost the labour needed to bring surplus to market. Others are simply dead. The flow of food from countryside to city slows to a trickle. Merchants who handle long-distance trade flee early. They have the resources and connections to escape, and they're among the first to hear about plague approaching from other cities. Their departure removes luxury goods first, but eventually affects staples too as trade networks collapse. Imported salt, spices, dried fish, wine, all become scarce. Bakeries close when bakers die or flee, when grain supplies run out, or when there aren't enough customers to maintain business. The social fabric of bread distribution, the daily visits to the baker, the predictable availability of fresh bread, disappears. People who relied on buying bread daily suddenly need to figure out how to make their own, assuming they can get grain. If you're stuck in a city, you need to stockpile before the crisis hits. Grain stores well if kept dry and protected from rodents. Dried beans and peas last for years. Salt-preserved meat and fish can last months. Dried fruits, nuts, honey, anything with low moisture content that won't spoil. How much do you need? Assume you're planning for at least 1 year of disrupted supply chains, possibly longer. For one person, you're looking at roughly 400 to 500 pounds of grain per year, plus supplemental protein and vegetables. For a family, multiply accordingly. This is a massive amount of food to store and protect. In a city apartment or small house, storing 2,000 plus pounds of food presents serious practical challenges. Where do you put it all? How do you keep it dry? How do you protect it from rats? How do you keep it secret from neighbours who might try to steal it? Use every available space creatively. Under beds, in corners, in the ceiling space if accessible. Sealed jars and barrels can be stacked. Some food can be stored in locations you don't sleep or live in, a cellar if you have one, or even a rented storage space if available and affordable. Distribute your stockpile across multiple locations if possible, so that theft or fire in one location doesn't destroy everything. Protection from rats requires vigilance. Any container that's not rat-proof will be compromised. Cloth sacks are useless. Rats chew right through them. Wooden barrels are better but not perfect if they have gaps. Sealed ceramic jars are best. Metal containers if you can afford them. Check stockpiles regularly for signs of gnawing or rat droppings. Secrecy is critical in a city environment. If neighbours know you have food stores when they're starving, they'll try to take them. By force if necessary. Don't talk about your preparations. Keep acquisitions discreet. Bring food into your home in ways that don't advertise what you're doing. Late at night, in containers that don't obviously contain food. A little at a time rather than all at once. Water in cities is more complicated. Public wells and fountains continue to operate, but going to them means exposure to crowds, exactly what you're trying to avoid. If possible, have someone make water runs during off hours when fewer people are around. Early morning or late evening. Always maintain distance from others. Boil the water if you can. Public water sources become gathering points and therefore disease transmission sites. Everyone needs water, so everyone congregates at wells and fountains. People talk, wait in lines, jostle against each other. Pneumonic plague spreads through the air at these crowded locations. Contaminated buckets and ropes touch clean ones. Sick people cough into the crowd. Timing your water collection matters. Dawn is often best. Fewer people are awake and moving. Just before curfew in the evening can also work. Avoid midday when markets and churches bring maximum crowds into the streets. Avoid Sundays when everyone goes to church and then to market. Choose your timing strategically to minimize human contact. When you do go to collect water, maintain maximum distance from others. If someone is at the well, wait until they leave before approaching. Don't engage in conversation. Don't touch common surfaces like well ropes or bucket handles any more than necessary. Carry your own bucket and rope if possible. Get your water and leave immediately. Some wealthy city dwellers had private cisterns or wells in their courtyards. If you have this, you're golden. If not, you might consider negotiating access to someone else's private well, trading goods for water access without having to visit public fountains. Private wells in cities were luxury items owned by wealthy households or institutions like monasteries. If you're connected to such a household, as a servant, family member, or business associate, you might arrange access, offer payment, trade goods, or provide services in exchange for being able to draw water from their private source. This eliminates your need to visit public fountains and dramatically reduces exposure risk. Alternatively, rainwater collection can supplement your water supply. Set up containers to catch roof runoff during rainstorms. The water won't be perfectly clean, but it's likely safer than public fountains during plague outbreaks. Boil it before drinking. You won't collect enough to meet all your needs, but every gallon you gather from rain is one less trip to the public well. Gardens become crucial. If you have any outdoor space at all, a courtyard, a small yard, turn it into intensive food production. Vegetables grow quickly. Herbs provide both food and medicine. Even a small garden can supplement your diet significantly. Urban gardens can't provide all your calories, but they make a real difference. A small plot of 10 by 10 feet can produce significant quantities of fast-growing vegetables. Radishes mature in 30 days. Lettuce and other greens in 40 to 50 days. Beans, peas, carrots, turnips, all feasible in small spaces with intensive care. Vertical grow-in helps maximize limited space. Train beans and peas to grow up stakes or trellises. Plant herbs in window boxes. Use pots and containers to expand growing area beyond ground space. Medieval city dwellers already did this to some extent, but in plague conditions it becomes critically important. Herb gardens provide both culinary and medicinal value. Garlic, mint, lavender, rosemary all grow easily in small spaces. They're useful for cooking, for medicinal purposes, and for flea prevention. A few pots of herbs on a windowsill or courtyard can provide ongoing harvests throughout the growing season. The psychological aspect of food scarcity matters too. When you're hoarding food while your neighbours starve, you become a target. You need to be discreet about your supplies. Don't advertise that you're well stocked. Keep stores hidden. Be prepared to defend your resources if necessary. The moral burden of having food while others starve is heavy. You'll hear neighbours begging for food. You'll see children obviously malnourished. You'll watch people weaken from hunger and know you could help but don't, because sharing means you run out faster. This creates guilt and psychological stress, but the alternative, distributing your food to the hungry, means you starve too, just on a slightly delayed schedule. And every person you interact with to give food could transmit plague to you. Charity and compassion are luxuries you can't afford during plague. You need to steel yourself against appeals for help and focus on preserving your own household. Medieval society had strong communal expectations about sharing during times of hardship. But during the plague, those social bonds broke down. People became desperate. Theft increased. Violence over resources wasn't uncommon. Your stockpile could make you wealthy, or it could make you a victim. Food riots and violence were documented in several plague-struck cities. Starving mobs attacked grain warehouses, bakeries were looted. Wealthy homes known to have food stores were raided. In some cases, authorities lost control entirely, and lawlessness reigned until the plague burned out, or enough people died that resources became less scarce. Defending your stockpile might require actual force. Can you bar your door against intruders? Do you have weapons? Are you willing to use violence to protect your food? These are ugly questions with ugly answers, but they're questions you need to consider. A stockpile you can't defend is just a stockpile waiting to be stolen. One strategy. If you have excess supplies, you might trade them carefully at a distance for other necessities or for labour. But every transaction is a risk. Every person you interact with could be carrying the disease. Trading during plague requires elaborate precautions. Meet in open air with significant distance between parties. Exchange goods through intermediary objects. Place items on the ground, back away, let the other party approach and take them. Never hand things directly person to person. Payment goes through the vinegar bucket. Inspect goods from a distance before accepting them. What you might trade: excess grain for vegetables you can't grow, preserved meat for fresh eggs, stored goods for labour on critical tasks you can't do yourself. But every trade requires careful assessment of whether the benefit outweighs the exposure risk. Often, it doesn't. Isolation and making do with what you have is safer than trading for marginal improvements. The survivors of the Black Death were often those with resources and the ruthlessness to hoard them. It's not noble, but it's effective. Your generosity won't matter if you starve to death or catch the plague from someone you're trying to help. This is one of the plague's cruelest lessons. The moral virtues that medieval society prized: charity, generosity, communal support, self-sacrifice, became liabilities during the plague. The survival virtues, hoarding, isolation, self-preservation, ruthlessness, were morally condemned, but practically effective. The people who survived weren't necessarily the best people by medieval standards. They were the people willing to abandon those standards when necessary. Chapter 6. Maintaining mental health in isolation. Here's what nobody tells you about surviving a pandemic. The disease might not kill you, but the isolation might break you. Medieval people were deeply social. Community wasn't optional, it was survival. You worked together, worshipped together, celebrated together. Your identity was tied to your role in the community, and now you're cutting yourself off from all of that, possibly for years. The psychological toll of isolation during the Black Death was immense. Contemporary accounts describe people going mad from loneliness, from watching their communities die, from the sheer weight of constant death. Some fell into deep depression, others developed paranoia, some turned to religious extremism, joining flagellant movements that wandered from town to town, whipping themselves in public penance. Mental breakdown during plague isolation took many forms. Some people became catatonic, unable to function even for basic self-care. They'd stop eating, stop moving, just sit and stare at nothing. Others became manic, exhibiting frenzied energy, talking to themselves, engaging in compulsive behaviors like scrubbing already clean floors for hours. Depression manifested as overwhelming hopelessness. What's the point of surviving if everyone you love is dead? Why maintain isolation protocols when death seems inevitable anyway? Some plague survivors describe periods where they simply wanted to give up, to walk into a plague-ridden city and let fate take them. The effort of survival seemed too much when the future looked empty. Anxiety and paranoia created different problems. Every cough became a sign of plague. Every headache meant death. People in isolation became hypervigilant, unable to sleep because they were constantly monitoring themselves and others for symptoms. Some developed paranoid delusions, believing that household members were secretly infected, or that the plague was punishment for specific personal sins. Religious mania swept through plague-stricken Europe, partly as a psychological response to overwhelming trauma. The flagellant movements, groups of people who wandered from town to town whipping themselves bloody in public displays of penance, represented one extreme response. They believed their suffering would appease God and end the plague. Their movement spread rapidly in 1348 to 1349, attracting thousands before church authorities condemned it. Flagellants would arrive in a town, march to the church or market square, and begin their ritual. They'd strip to the waist and beat themselves and each other with leather whips embedded with metal studs. Blood would flow. They'd chant prayers and hymns. They'd demand that townspeople join them in penance. The spectacle was horrifying and mesmerizing. The movement represented a psychological break from rational plague response. Instead of isolation and hygiene, flagellants crowded together. Instead of avoiding the sick, they wandered into plague zones. They spread disease while claiming to cure it. But the movement met deep psychological needs for people traumatized by the plague. It offered a sense of control, community, and purpose when everything else had collapsed. Your mental health strategy needs to be as rigorous as your physical isolation protocol. First, maintain routine. Structure your days with regular activities. Medieval people lived by church bells and natural light cycles. You need your own schedule. Wake at the same time. Eat at regular hours. Work on necessary tasks. Exercise. Rest. Routine provides psychological stability when everything else is chaos. The human brain craves predictability. When external circumstances are chaotic and threatening, internal structure provides an anchor. Create a daily schedule and stick to it as closely as possible. This might seem trivial when you're facing a deadly plague, but the psychological benefits are real. A sample routine, wake at dawn, say morning prayers, or meditate Whether you're religious or not, the ritual helps. Eat a simple breakfast, work on necessary tasks, tending garden, caring for animals, maintaining shelter, rest midday during the hottest part of the day, more work in the afternoon, evening meal, time for activities like storytelling, music or crafts, sleep at a consistent time. The consistency matters more than the specific activities. Your brain learns the pattern and finds comfort in it. Even if external circumstances are terrifying, you have control over your daily structure. This sense of control, however small, provides psychological stability. Physical activity is crucial. You're probably doing manual labour anyway if you're on a rural estate, but make it deliberate. Work your body enough to stay strong and to exhaust yourself for better sleep. Medieval people were generally more physically active than modern humans, which actually helped with mental health. Exercise produces endorphins that improve mood. It reduces stress hormones. It helps regulate sleep. It provides a sense of accomplishment. You can see the results of your physical work. In an isolation situation where so much feels uncertain and out of control, physical work gives you concrete, visible progress. Vary your physical activities if possible. Gardening, chopping wood, repairing buildings, walking the perimeter of your property. Different activities use different muscle groups and prevent boredom. The change of activity provides mental stimulation even while maintaining a routine structure. Push yourself physically enough to create genuine fatigue. Not injury-level exertion, but enough that you're tired at the end of the day. This exhaustion helps you sleep better, and good sleep is critical for mental health. Poor sleep creates a vicious cycle of declining mental and physical health. If you can read, that's a tremendous advantage. Books were rare and expensive in medieval times, but if you have access to any texts, religious, classical, practical, reading provides mental escape and stimulation. The wealthy who survived the plague often described reading as a lifeline. Reading transports your mind to different times, places, and situations. It provides distraction from immediate circumstances. It exercises your brain, keeping mental faculties sharp. It gives you something to think about beyond the plague and survival concerns. Medieval books were precious objects, hand-copied manuscripts that cost small fortunes. Religious texts were most common. Bibles, prayer books, saints' lives, classical texts from ancient Greece and Rome, medical texts, agricultural manuals, poetry and stories. If you owned even a handful of books, you were wealthy. Read slowly and carefully, extracting maximum value from limited texts. Reread books multiple times, finding new meaning in each reading. If you're sharing isolation with others, read aloud. This provides entertainment for everyone and creates shared experience that maintains social bonds. If you can't read, storytelling serves the same purpose. Memorize stories, songs, prayers. Recite them to yourself. Create your own narratives. Your mind needs engagement beyond immediate survival tasks. Oral culture was primary in medieval society. Stories, songs, and poems were memorized and performed. People entertained themselves and others through storytelling. Every community had individuals known for their repertoire of tales, myths, legends, historical accounts, funny anecdotes. In isolation, your memorized stories become valuable mental resources. Recall them in detail, embellish them, create new variations. If you're isolated with others, take turns telling stories. Encourage children to learn and perform stories. This preserves the oral tradition while providing entertainment and mental stimulation. Create new stories too. Narrativize your own experience if it helps process trauma, but also invent completely fictional tales. Escape into imagination, fantasy, adventure, romance, whatever genre appeals to you. The creative act of storytelling engages your mind in ways that passive consumption doesn't. Spiritual practice, whether you're genuinely religious or not, provides structure and comfort. Medieval people had a framework for understanding suffering through Christianity: daily prayers, reading religious texts, contemplation. These activities filled time and provided psychological support. You don't have to believe in the theology to benefit from the routine. Prayer and meditation create mental calm. The repetitive nature of prayers, saying the same words daily, provides comfort through familiarity. The meditative aspect of contemplation helps quiet anxious thoughts. The framework of religious meaning helps contextualize suffering in ways that make it bearable. Medieval Christianity taught that suffering had purpose. It was punishment for sin, test of faith, opportunity for penance, or path to salvation. Whether or not you believe this theology, the framework provides psychological advantage by making suffering meaningful rather than random and pointless. Create a daily spiritual practice even if you're not religious. Morning and evening meditation or contemplation, mindfulness exercises, gratitude practices where you consciously acknowledge things you're grateful for. These practices, stripped of religious content, still provide psychological benefits through routine and mental discipline. If you're isolated with family or a small group, maintain positive relationships. The stress of prolonged isolation can destroy relationships quickly. People get on each other's nerves. Small annoyances become major conflicts. You need to actively work on communication, patience, and forgiveness. Proximity breeds conflict even in normal times. In isolation, where you can't escape each other, minor personality differences become major irritations. Someone's eating habits, way of speaking, work methods, things you could ignore in normal life become infuriating when you're stuck together 24/7. Communication is critical. Address problems early before they fester. Use "I feel" statements rather than accusations. "I feel frustrated when tools aren't returned to their place" works better than "you're so messy and irresponsible." Small grievances need to be aired and resolved, or they accumulate into explosive conflicts. Forgiveness becomes a survival skill. People will annoy you. They'll make mistakes. They'll say things they shouldn't. In normal times, you distance yourself temporarily to cool off. In isolation, you can't. You need to forgive quickly and move on, or hold grudges that poison the entire group dynamic. Create space for individual alone time, even within group isolation. Everyone needs periods of solitude. Designate times or spaces where individuals can be alone without it being interpreted as rejection of the group. A walk around the property alone, an hour in a separate room, time to pursue individual activities. These breaks from constant proximity help maintain sanity. Establish rules and responsibilities clearly. Who does what chores? What behaviors are acceptable or unacceptable? How are decisions made? Without clear structure, conflicts arise over every small issue. With established rules, daily life proceeds more smoothly even under stress. Create small pleasures. Medieval life wasn't completely grim even during the plague. Music, if you can make it. Games, chess existed, dice games, card games, cooking something special when you have the ingredients, tending a garden, watching sunsets. These small moments of beauty and enjoyment matter for mental health. Simple pleasures take on outsized importance in isolation. A meal with herbs and spices instead of bland porridge becomes a celebration. A sunny day when you can work outside instead of being trapped indoors is a joy. Finding the first spring flowers or harvest vegetables from your garden provides genuine happiness. Music is particularly powerful for mental health. Singing relieves stress and creates community feeling when done in groups. Playing simple instruments, flutes, drums, stringed instruments if you have them, provides entertainment and creative outlet. Medieval people sang constantly. Work songs, religious hymns, folk ballads. Music made hard labor bearable and provided emotional release. games engage the mind and provide social interaction that's fun rather than task-focused. Chess requires strategic thinking and provides hours of engagement. Dice games add excitement through chance. Card games, which were just being introduced to Europe in the 1300s, offer variety. Even simple children's games provide entertainment and maintain family bonds. Cooking becomes both necessity and pleasure. Experiment with what ingredients you have. Try new combinations. Make special dishes for occasions, even if the occasion is just surviving another week. The sensory pleasure of good. Food, taste, smell, texture provides genuine enjoyment that counterbalances the stress of isolation. Nature observation offers free mental respite. Watch birds, track the progress of seasons, observe clouds and weather patterns, notice the growth of plants. Medieval people were closely attuned to natural cycles because their survival depended on it. But beyond practical observation, there's psychological benefit in the beauty and constancy of nature. The seasons change, plants grow, animals continue their behaviors. Life goes on despite human catastrophe. One aspect of plague survival that's often overlooked: survivor's guilt. As you watch your community die while you remain safe, guilt can be overwhelming. Why did you survive when others died? What right do you have to save yourself while others suffer? Survivor's guilt is a psychological burden that plague survivors carried for life. The randomness of who lived and who died created profound questions of meaning and fairness. Good people died, bad people survived. Pious families were wiped out while skeptics thrived. Children died while elderly survived. Nothing made sense. The guilt manifests in different ways. Some survivors developed what we'd now recognize as PTSD, intrusive thoughts about the dead, nightmares, emotional numbness. Others became obsessed with finding meaning in their survival, convinced they must have been spared for some special purpose. Some fell into self-destructive behaviors, unconsciously trying to punish themselves for living. Religious frameworks offered one way to process survivors' guilt. Maybe God spared you for a reason. Maybe you were meant to rebuild, to serve others, to bear witness. Medieval Christianity could contextualize survival as part of divine plan, which helped some people accept their survival and move forward. But not everyone found comfort in religious explanations. If God spared you, did that mean those who died were less worthy? Were they being punished while you were being rewarded? The theology created as many problems as it solved. You need to make peace with this. Survival isn't immoral. Taking care of yourself and your family isn't selfish. The alternative, joining the dying to prove your compassion, doesn't help anyone. It just adds one more body to the pile. Rationalize your survival through practicality rather than moral judgment. You survived because you had resources others didn't, knowledge others lacked, and luck. Not because you deserved it more than those who died. Not because you were better or more valuable. Just because circumstances aligned in your favor. Accept that you couldn't save everyone. You couldn't save most people. You could barely save yourself and maybe a small group. That's the reality of plague. Acknowledging your limitations helps process the guilt. You're not responsible for deaths you couldn't prevent, and you're not morally culpable for surviving when you took reasonable actions to preserve your life. Some people dealt with survivor's guilt through religious devotion, dedicating their survival to serving God. Others threw themselves into rebuilding after the plague passed. Some never really processed it and carried the trauma for life. You need to find your own way to accept that survival sometimes requires hard choices. Post-plague religious vocations increased significantly. Many survivors became monks, nuns, or priests, dedicating their lives to God in thanks for surviving or to atone for perceived sins. Others engaged in charitable works, founding hospitals, orphanages, or programs to help plague victims and survivors. This service helped them find meaning in survival. Secular survivors often focused on rebuilding communities and economies. They threw themselves into work, into creating new businesses, into political activity. The frenetic activities serve both practical purposes and psychological ones. Staying busy prevented dwelling on traumatic memories. But some survivors never recovered psychologically. They lived the rest of their lives haunted by plague memories. Some described being unable to form close relationships because they feared losing people again. Others engaged in risky behaviors, having lost fear of death. Some turned to alcohol or other forms of self-medication to cope with persistent trauma. Alcohol is available. Ale was a staple drink in medieval Europe. But be cautious. Drinking to cope with isolation and trauma can spiral quickly. Medieval society didn't understand addiction, but they certainly experienced it. Keep alcohol consumption moderate and functional. Ale was ubiquitous in medieval life, safer to drink than water, caloric and mildly intoxicating. People drank ale with every meal. Workers received ale as part of their wages. Children drank weak ale. Abstaining entirely would be unusual. But there's a difference between regular consumption and drinking to cope. If you're drinking to numb fear, suppress grief, or escape reality, you're in dangerous territory. Alcohol doesn't solve problems. It postpones dealing with them while creating new problems. Medieval. People recognized problematic drinking when it interfered with work, family, or religious duties. Monasteries regulated ale consumption for monks. Employers punished workers who were drunk when they should be working. But the concept of addiction as a medical condition didn't exist. It was seen as moral failing or lack of self-control. In isolation, drinking can become a dangerous habit quickly. You're bored, scared, depressed. Alcohol provides temporary relief, but it impairs judgment, weakens immune function, creates dependence, and worsens depression over time. If you find yourself drinking more and more to get through days, you need to recognize the problem and cut back. Watch for signs of serious mental deterioration. If you or someone in your group starts showing signs of severe depression, psychosis, or suicidal thinking, you're in crisis. Medieval people had no concept of mental health treatment beyond prayer and sometimes physical restraint. Your options are limited, but maintaining social connection within your isolated group, staying active and focusing on concrete tasks can help. Severe depression presents as complete loss of interest in life. The person stops caring about survival. They might stop eating, stop working, stop maintaining hygiene. They express hopelessness and might talk about death as a relief. This is a medical emergency, though medieval people had no treatment for it. Your options are limited, but not zero. Keep the person physically safe. Prevent access to means of self-harm. Maintain their nutrition and hydration, even if you have to coax or insist. Keep them engaged with simple tasks and activities. Ensure they get sunlight and physical activity. Social connection helps. Talk to them. Include them in group activities. Remind them they're valued. Psychosis, loss of touch with reality, manifests as hallucinations, delusions, or extremely disordered thinking. The person might see or hear things that aren't there. They might believe impossible things, that they're already dead, that everyone is plotting against them, that the plague is punishment for specific personal sins. They might become unable to distinguish reality from fantasy. Medieval people understood psychosis as madness or demonic possession. Treatment ranged from prayer to exorcism to physical restraint to simply isolating the person to prevent them from harming themselves or others. In your isolation situation, focus on keeping the person safe, maintaining their basic needs, and hoping the episode passes. Suicidal thinking is the most immediate danger. If someone expresses desire to die, plans how to do it, or takes actions toward self-harm, they need constant supervision. Remove means of self-harm, weapons, rope, poisons. Don't leave them alone. Engage them in conversation about reasons to live. This is exhausting for caregivers, but it's necessary. The people who survived the Black Death with their minds intact were often those who had purpose beyond mere survival. They planned for rebuilding. They maintained hope that life would eventually return to normal. They found meaning in their survival. Purpose provides psychological resilience. If you're surviving for something, to rebuild your family, to preserve your estate, to see your children grow, to accomplish specific goals, you have motivation beyond just staying alive. The survival itself has meaning. Hope operates similarly, believing that the plague will end, that normal life will return, that the future holds possibilities. This hope sustains you through immediate hardship. Without hope, survival becomes pointless suffering. With hope, suffering becomes temporary challenge with future reward. Meaning can come from many sources. Religious meaning, God spared you for a purpose. Family meaning, you must survive to care for dependents or continue the family line. Social meaning, you're preserving knowledge, skills, or resources that will be valuable for rebuilding. Personal meaning, you have work to finish, experiences to have, goals to achieve. Find your own sources of purpose, hope, and meaning. They'll be different for each person, but without them, the psychological burden of isolation and survival becomes nearly unbearable. With them, you have the mental resilience to endure until the plague passes. Your psychological resilience matters as much as your physical preparations. A person who breaks mentally might compromise the entire isolation protocol in a moment of desperation or madness. Protecting your mind is protecting your life. Mental breakdown can destroy isolation discipline instantly. A person in crisis might flee the isolation compound seeking human contact. They might refuse to maintain hygiene protocols. They might insist on caring for sick people without protection. They might become violent or erratic in ways that endanger the group. Preventing mental breakdown through proactive mental health maintenance is cheaper than dealing with crisis after it develops. Routine, physical activity, social connection, purpose, meaning, small pleasures, these aren't luxuries. They're survival necessities just as much as food and water. Neglect mental health, and you'll eventually face psychological crisis that threatens physical survival. The medieval people who survived the Black Death weren't necessarily those who made the best physical preparations. They were those who made adequate physical preparations and maintained their psychological resilience through trauma that would break most people. Mental strength made the difference between those who survived and those who gave up or made fatal errors from psychological impairment. Conclusion: the cost of survival. So there you have it, a comprehensive guide to surviving the Black Death. We've covered isolation protocols, recognizing symptoms, securing resources, maintaining mental health, understanding social changes, and navigating the aftermath. If you followed these strategies, you'd have given yourself the best possible chance at survival during history's deadliest pandemic. But let's be brutally honest about what survival actually required. It required resources most people simply didn't have. Country estates, stored food, the wealth to flee. It required knowledge that didn't exist in medieval culture. Germ theory, disease transmission, the value of quarantine. It required ruthlessness that violated every moral norm. Abandoning sick loved ones, hoarding resources while neighbors starved, prioritizing yourself over your community. Most fundamentally, it required becoming someone medieval society would condemn. The ideal medieval person was pious, communal, self-sacrificing, and obedient to authority. The person who survived the Black Death was pragmatic, isolated, self-preserving, and willing to ignore both social expectations and religious teachings. This is the real cost of survival. You had to betray almost everything your culture valued. You had to choose life over honor, safety over duty, isolation over community. You had to watch people you loved die while you refused to help them. You had to become the person everyone else thought was a coward and a sinner. And even after making all those sacrifices, you still might die. One infected flea, one moment of exposure, one unlucky breath of contaminated air. The plague didn't care about your preparations or your moral compromises. The survivors of the Black Death weren't necessarily the best people by medieval standards. They were the wealthiest, the luckiest, the most ruthless, and the most willing to abandon social norms. Many carried crushing guilt for the rest of their lives. Many were traumatized by what they'd witnessed and what they'd done to survive. But they also inherited a transformed world. The rigid feudal order was shattered. Opportunities emerged for social mobility that had been impossible before. New ways of thinking about disease, society, and human agency took root. The medieval world died with the plague victims, and what emerged was the foundation of the modern world. Your survival, had you lived through it, would have made you part of that transformation. The brutal choices you made, however contrary to medieval values, would have been vindicated by the better world that eventually emerged. The plague cleared away the old order, and survivors built something new. So could you have survived the Black Death? Maybe, if you had wealth, knowledge, discipline, ruthlessness, and extraordinary luck. If you could make impossible choices and live with the consequences. If you could maintain your humanity while doing inhumane things. If you could survive not just the disease, but the guilt, the isolation, and the psychological cost of watching your world die. The Black Death teaches us that survival during catastrophe isn't just about individual actions, it's about having advantages that most people lack. The plague exposed every inequality in medieval society. Those who survived were often those already privileged, or those willing to seize opportunities others couldn't. But it also teaches us that humans are extraordinarily resilient. Even facing incomprehensible catastrophe, people found ways to survive, rebuild, and create meaning. They processed unimaginable trauma and constructed new lives in a transformed world. That's the real lesson. Not just how to survive, but what survival costs and what you do with the life you've preserved. If you found this deep dive fascinating, smash that subscribe button and hit the notification bell. We explore history's darkest realities every week, giving you the unfiltered truth about what life was actually like in the past. And here's a final question. Knowing what survival required during the Black Death, what would you have done? Would you have fled your city and abandoned your community? Would you have isolated your sick family members and watched them die alone? Would you have done whatever it took to survive? Or would you have chosen compassion over survival? Let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching, and remember, the past is far stranger, more brutal, and more complex than we usually imagine. See you in the next one.